Good day, everybody. We've got people still joining. Give us another minute or so and we'll get started. Okay, I have 12:02, so let's begin. Good day, everyone. Thanks for attending our next webinar at the WBDC. We're talking about freight forwarding again today. This is the second part of our freight forwarding programs, and off we go. You know what? I'm going to have to go out and come back. Wait a minute. There we go. All right, for those, thanks for the patience of those who have attended previous webinars. I've got to get through several screens, just sort of describing who's who. And I'm at the Women's Business Development Center in downtown Chicago. And the Women's Business Development Center is a nonprofit, very well-known, well-established nonprofit that is devoted to supporting and accelerating women's business ownership and strengthening the impact of women on the economy. Within the WBDC, we also have several other programs. One's called the Illinois SBDC, the Small Business Development Center. This is for any type of company that's starting up or that needs some help in terms of startup advice or some research or business plan analysis, etc. We have programs at the WBDC that can help you with your business, whether you're exporting or not. Also, if you're interested in government sales, we've got what's called a PTAC, which is another center that's focused on coaching and advising businesses about how to sell to governments, whether it's the city of Chicago or the county or the federal government. There's a lot of expertise there, and we've helped a lot of companies get into government sales. So if you're interested in any other information or advice or coaching, go to the WBDC website and you'll see information about these organizations, centers within the WBDC. So I'm running the International Trade Center there, and note that we're an extension of the state of Illinois, and the ITC has clients both within the WBDC and outside the WBDC. So you don't have to be associated with the organization for the ITC to help you. What are type of things that we talk to companies about? We help companies both who want to start exporting and some that are already doing it and just want to grow. We can talk about export strategy and readiness. We can help you develop a plan. We can talk about channels. We can do some market research for you and identify countries and segments and partners that may help you to grow your exports. We can talk about international shipping and logistics, as we're doing today. We can talk about payments and credit insurance, and also grant programs that are available. So we're the one-stop shop. We have access to a network of experts that can help you. So if it's just a one-off question, reach out to us. That's okay. Or if you want to start on the journey to exports, we're the place for you to come. So my background, briefly is I've got 30 years of private sector experience in exporting, worked for different American companies and managed their business all over the world. It took me into a lot of different products and industries, which I feel fortunate to have had that helps me in this position because I've been into commercial markets, industrial markets, do it yourself, retail markets, and yeah, that's my background. So I want you to know that the state of Illinois supports exporting. Through the Office of Trade and Investment at the state, there's offices, there's an office downtown that's got Chicago-based international trade specialists that are there to help you, as well as offices around the world. So the state of Illinois stands by to assist, and we can work with you to work with the Illinois people to grow your business. Note there's what's called Istep Grants. These are grants that could subsidize some of your export activities, such as trade missions or trade shows or product compliance, getting UL Canada approvals or EU approvals, can help with website localization. There are funds available for companies. Now, generally, it must be made in Illinois, products or services. And note that there's also additional grants available if you're into food products. So if you're interested in grants, reach out to us and we can talk more about the availability and possibility and requirements there. So what are we going to do today? Today, we're going to talk about Freight Forwarding 201. Like I said, we had done a previous Freight Forwarding 101 about a month ago that talked about the role of the freight forwarder. We'll do a brief review of Freight Forwarder 101, and then we'll get into the second part today of our two-part program, a deeper dive into freight forwarding. We'll talk about best practices. We'll talk about Incoterms, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's just a real key part of freight forwarding and quoting your products and your terms and conditions of how you might relate to your customers, and how Incoterms relate to payments and your shipping terms, how freight forwarding relates to product compliance. So we'll touch on these. We have, as we did last time, LR International, Paul Jarzambek as our expert speaker. I've known the people at LR International for many years, and they're one of the leading forwarding companies in the Midwest. They're very experienced with international issues. I've sat in on a lot of different LR International seminars over the years, and I'm really glad that they'll be with us today. So we'll get through this. We'll take about an hour with the presentation. We'll, if we go over, we're okay. We'll go over. We'll try to leave room for Q&A at the end. So if you've got questions, put in your questions, and we'll cover what we can, and we'll go from there. So let's proceed. There's the prelims. Now, there's Paul. We'll get into our Freight Forwarder 201 today, and let me introduce Paul Jarzambek.
Okay, thanks, Bill. As Bill said, my name is Paul Jarzambek. My company is LR International. We're freight forwarders and customs brokers located 2 miles east of O'Hare International Airport in Chicago here. Bill, can you hear me okay? Am I coming through well?
Yes, you're good.
Okay,
everything's
great.
good.
Just wanted to double check that.
Yep.
So as Bill mentioned, I've got 30 years of experience in freight forwarding. That's actually been my entire career has been on the logistics and freight forwarder customs broker side of exporting and importing. And in our first session about a month ago, we talked about some of the identifying what a freight forwarder is, and also, what a customs broker is, because even though this is an export program, we're talking exports. Those two entities, a freight forwarder and customs broker, work together really on the process when goods are exported from the United States to around the world. That's our website there on the page, just so you know how to get to us there. We've got some pretty good information about a variety of topics, especially under the Learning Center up at the top bar there. Some conversions, some pictures and dimensions of ocean containers and trucks and things of that nature to kind of help customers understand maybe the space or weight limitations that we're sort of dealing with on the international side. You can go to the next slide, Bill. The next slide is just how our group is organized, our company is organized. When I first got into freight forwarding,
Sorry, Paul.
that's okay.
I'm trying to advance here.
Yeah, no problem.
Give me a minute.
When I first got into freight forwarding, you could be just a freight forwarder, or you could do just exports and not imports, or you could be just a customs broker. That was 30 years ago. Today, that's not really typical. Companies in our industry have to pretty much do everything. They have to be a freight forwarder, they have to be a customs broker, they have to provide, of course, logistics and transportation, warehousing, packing and crating. So that's something that if you were going to survive in our business, you had to evolve and get to, basically, and be able to do. And so the slide there just kind of shows the segments of our group, from freight forwarding to domestic to customs brokerage, documentation, consolidations, packing and crating, and things of that nature. You can go to the next slide, Bill. That's just who we are. You can get a hold of us in this way. Email us. You can email me directly, call us. Again, we're located 2 miles east of O'Hare International Airport. That's our headquarters and our largest warehousing facility, customs bonded warehouse facility, is located here in Franklin Park, Illinois. We also have 13 other warehouses in North America that we handle customers' cargo into and out of, both export and import cargo, everything from heavy lift to small packages to packing and crating, inventory management, fulfillment, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have partners all over the world, like a distributor network, that represent us in their country, and we represent them here. If you're working with a freight forwarder, they're going to have either a partner network around the world that supports them in countries all over the world, or they're going to have their own offices in some or all of those places. It depends on how they're structured. One isn't necessarily better than the other. It depends on what your particular needs are. Like choosing any vendor, there are some considerations based on size, coverage, just the personality connection that you have with the vendor. And so when you're choosing a freight forwarder or customs broker, you use some of those same, some of those same strategies in choosing a vendor. You can go to the next slide, Bill. This slide was designed just to real basic, show you the process. So if you're a company here in the United States as the exporter, up at the top there, you have a product and you enter into an agreement, often in the form of a sales contract, for an importer in the other country. So pick any country in the world, let's say Japan as an example. That importer, that company in Japan, wants to buy your product, and you enter into an agreement to export it. You're now going to need some service providers to help you do that. You can make the product, and you can make the best product in the world, which a lot of US companies do. You can market it well, price it at the right level, et cetera, and produce it under a deadline maybe. But now you need vendors to help you actually export it. And a freight forwarder on the lower left there is typically the company that kind of works with or represents the exporter. There are carriers that freight forwarders book space with, and the carriers are of all shapes and sizes: airlines, steamship lines that own ships, like what's pictured there, railroads, trucking companies. There are many different service providers that you could use to finalize an export. We had a job years ago in Brazil, and the only way to get the cargo to the customer, and I mentioned this when we did the 101 program last month, the final leg, we actually had to use pack mules, burros, to carry these parts to the customer where they were located in Brazil, because they were basically located on a mountain, or a small mountain, and we that's the only way we could get the goods there. Another case in Brazil, we had to use rafts on the Amazon River to move cargo the last segment. Sounds strange, but it was the only way really to get that cargo to the location. It was just a remote location. So if it can move cargo as a freight forwarder, we probably have a way or a mechanism to access the space. And that's essentially what a freight forwarder does. We buy and resell space. That's the core function. And you have to have licenses from our federal government in order to do that. So there's some pretty strict controls and things you have to do. And then we do a whole host of other things in the area of documentation, making sure you get paid. We're going to talk about that a little later. Packing and crating. We may store cargo for a period of time for a customer, or receive cargo from 10 or 15 different vendors on behalf of a customer, and then assemble all those different shipments into one shipment, and then move that one shipment to Europe or Asia or Latin America. So a freight forwarder does a lot of functions, but the core thing that we do is we buy and resell space. Okay. Carriers are who we buy it from, and a customs broker is the party on the other side. That picture there in the lower right-hand corner is my buddy Tim from Germany, who we've worked with for 20 plus years in the Munich office there. And they do the import side of the transaction, whereas the freight forwarder does the export side. Okay, we're talking mostly freight forwarder today. So you can go to the next slide. Freight forwarding services, we covered this a month ago. This is some of the basics: moving cargo, documentation, assisting with payment instruments. We're going to talk about those a little later. I did mention in the 101 program last month, cargo insurance. If you were in that program, you might remember. If you weren't, make a note of this on this slide, okay? Cargo insurance is a critical piece to exporting. You may think to yourself, well, it's not really necessary. I have insurance through our property and casualty coverage at our company, or my customer says they're covering it, so I don't have to. Or you may be thinking, what could really happen? I mean, what's the chances that something will happen? Well, I'm here to tell you the chances are somewhat likely. In my experience in 30 years, when it does happen, it's always the most inopportune, most critical shipment that could ever happen. And usually the claim is somewhat significant. So it's not just a little minor something or other. It's usually more than that. Cargo insurance is critical. International carriers all over the world have limits of liability that are laughable. So they're protected if they damage or lose your cargo. So you will not be able to pursue them for compensation, because their limits of liability are embedded in the booking process and the transport document issuance process, whether you realize it or not. It's one of these, it's like when you scroll through your phone and you hit I agree, you really have no idea what you were agreeing to, but in order to move on, you have to agree. Well, it's kind of like that with carriers around the world moving cargo for customers. Their limits of liability are embedded there, and whether you're aware of them or not, when a claim happens, those carriers aren't going to pay for having damaged or lost your goods. So cargo insurance is critical. If you don't really remember much of today, there's a few things I'm going to focus in on and tell you, please remember this. That's one of them. Make sure your shipments are all insured. You can do that through your freight forwarder. You can also buy a policy on your own. Even integrated carriers like UPS, DHL, FedEx, they offer cargo insurance, and I would highly recommend it. Almost all basic property and casualty business policies are deficient when it comes to international shipping and claims and damage and that sort of thing. So rarely do I see P&C policies that have an international shipping component that's comprehensive enough to deal with the perils of the sea, we call them, especially for ocean freight. So keep that in mind. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Bill. Customs broker, again, back when we did the 101 program last month, just talked a little bit about the other side. This is an export program, and we're talking about freight forwarders, but it's kind of important to know what the customs broker on the other side is doing on behalf of your customer that you're exporting to. And in some cases, the freight forwarder that you're using is also the customs broker on the other side of the transaction in the other country. So you may be working kind of with one system there, and then they're definitely going to work, very closely together. So customs broker, the focus of a customs broker and what they do is a little different than a freight forwarder, because it's the import transaction. It has to do with consumption in the destination country and making sure that duties and taxes are paid to the government of that country. and complying with the import laws and regulations of that country, which every country is a little bit different. So it's involved, but as I said before, most freight forwarders today are also customs brokers and vice versa, because it's not common anymore in our industry to carve out and just be one or the other. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Bill. So now we're going to get into sort of the deeper dive today. So last time in the 101 program, we covered the role of the freight definition and role of a freight forwarder, role of the customs broker. We talked a little bit about Incoterms or trade terms. We talked about cargo insurance and risk management when you're exporting. And we touched on best practices for choosing a freight forwarder, which at the end of today's program, I'll mention that as well. How do you go about finding a good freight forwarder, or maybe a couple of good freight forwarders? Not uncommon for companies to have more than one. And there are many good freight forwarders out there, but there are equally as many, if not more, really crummy freight forwarders out there. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to go through that process of choosing a freight forwarder. But the bulk of what we're going to talk about today in a deeper dive in 201 is Incoterms and methods of payment. How do you get paid on your export orders? And then export compliance, making sure that when you export, if you've made a great product, you've sold it to somebody overseas, you've priced it in a way where you're pleased with the margin and the process of exporting. You've got your service providers, freight forwarder, customs broker, et cetera. You've done everything right, even Incoterm selection and cargo insurance and all that. You don't, as your last step, want to accidentally break any U.S. export laws that you as the exporter are responsible to adhere to. So we're going to talk about that. So today will be mostly Incoterms, methods of payment, making sure you get paid for your export orders, and export compliance. Incoterms are trade terms. They are acronyms. They're 3-letter acronyms. There's 11 total Incoterms. And those 3-letter acronyms were designed or created back in the 1930s. 1936 was when this process started. And they were designed to outline everybody's responsibilities, a seller and a buyer in an international transaction, who's responsible for what and how far in that transaction is what Incoterms were designed to provide clarity toward, helping everybody know what their responsibilities are. Now, those Incoterms are 3-letter terms, and they're designed to be used with what's called a named place. So you don't want to use Incoterms by themselves. You want to name a place with the Incoterm, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's important because I'll have clients that will call us and we'll be working on projects for them, and we'll say, well, what's the Incoterm? And they'll say, well, FOB. And our first question is, FOB where? Because FOB by itself doesn't really tell us the story. And really, that's what Incoterms do. They tell a story with regard to this transaction that everybody's about to get moving. The Incoterm lays out the story. What is the shipper going to do? What is the seller going to do? What is the buyer going to do in their country? And who's paying for those functions along the way? Now, one thing that Incoterms do not automatically do is determine title transfer. So a lot of people get this mixed up. They believe that an Incoterm automatically signifies when title transfers on the goods. In other words, when ownership transfers with the goods. Incoterms do not automatically do that. Incoterms are really about the shipping process, the documentation process, the cargo insurance, and who's controlling the movement of the goods from one country to another, and how far are they controlling the movement of those goods. Now, if your sales contract states that title will also transfer in conjunction with the Incoterm, then the Incoterm does denote title transfer or ownership transfer. But if your sales contract doesn't specifically say that, then the Incoterms are really about the shipping and the customs process in the other country and so forth, and not really about, you know, when title transfers. So we have a customer that ships a lot to India. They ship big, expensive pharmaceutical machinery to India, and they actually ship CIF, the port of the CIF. I forget the port in India that right now that they actually ship to, but they ship CIF the port in India. So their responsibility is to get the cargo from the US, in this case, they're an Illinois company, so from Illinois over to that port in India. And then once it arrives in the port in India, and of course they've insured it, that's where the CIF comes from. Once it arrives there, their customer takes over the customs process and actually gets the machine to their location in India. However, title doesn't transfer on their machines until they're actually installed at the customer's facility in India, and the customer has been able to run a certain number of samples with this machine. So our customer actually retains ownership until the machine is installed at their customer's facility and those samples are run. Then there's a sign off, and the ownership of that machine actually transfers at that point. So you can see there where the Incoterm doesn't really align with when the title transfers. You can go to the next slide, Bill. There's 4 groups of Incoterms: the E terms, the F terms, the C terms, and the D terms. Again, they're 3-letter acronyms. So in the E category, X Works is EXW. That's the acronym for X Works. One thing you should know about these groups is that if you were to draw a straight line under the F term main carriage unpaid line there, it would divide the E and the F terms together and the C and the D terms together. And that's a good way to look at it. That line between E and F and C and D is sort of like the line that separates the US from the rest of the world. So if you're using an E or an F Incoterm, it means that you are responsible to get your cargo to somewhere here in the United States, a named place in the United States. Now, in the E term, X Works category, that's very likely your facility. So if you had a manufacturing facility in Chicago, X Works Chicago, Illinois, USA, if you were going to use that term, would most likely be the term, okay? Because X Works specifically refers to the place where the goods are either manufactured or made available for first carriage, that would be a trucking company, to move them to start the export process, okay? E and F mean you're going to get the goods to somewhere here in the US, a named place. C and D mean that you, the exporter, are going to get the goods somewhere overseas, to a named place overseas. Could be a port, an airport, could be your customer's facility in Korea or wherever, okay? C and D mean that you're going to be responsible to get the goods to somewhere overseas. So a lot of the time we have people say, well, okay, that makes it simple then. I'm going to stick with E and F because I don't really know much about getting goods to Korea or India or Japan or Europe. And so if I just quote E and F, that'll mean that the customer will handle the shipping, and that's one less headache for me and one less cost or possibly cost variant that I have to concern myself with. Sounds logical, but in 30 years of doing this, I can tell you that that's not what I would recommend. I would recommend a C or a D term, and I've got some examples we're going to talk about in a minute, and I'll explain a little better why. But simply put, when you choose a C or a D term, you have greater control over how the process occurs. That becomes valuable, especially when something goes wrong, because your customer is always your customer. So whether they arrange the shipping or not, they will want satisfaction or help or whatever if something goes sideways. It's much easier for you to help if you've had a hand in the setting up or the booking process to get the goods to a place overseas. You have a little bit better input on keeping rates competitive, being able to at least shop them to a degree. From a payment standpoint, we're going to talk about that. You getting paid for your exports. If a customer is asking you for some kind of terms, you're not going to have 100% of your money up front before you ship. Controlling the shipping to an overseas point, very important, because it can become a leverage point for you in case you haven't been paid under the terms and conditions that you expected to be paid. Certainly from a cargo insurance standpoint, when you are controlling the shipping to an overseas point, you have a much better chance of an easier claim process if something does go wrong, damage or loss. Much easier if you're included in the booking process on the export side. And then lastly, from a compliance standpoint, we're going to talk about this in a minute, but as an exporter, no matter which of these Incoterms you choose, you as the exporter are 100% responsible for your company's adherence to U.S. export laws and regulations. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but when you don't control the shipping to an overseas port or airport or even to your customer's door, when you don't use a C and D term, your ability to make sure that all of the compliance points that are wrapped up in the U.S. export laws and regulations, making sure those are all covered and done correctly is much harder if you're using an E or an F term. And the government doesn't care about your Incoterms. They don't care if your customer controlled the shipping. If there was an infraction on the U.S. export laws or regulations, the government will fine or penalize you as the exporter, even though you may not have had anything to do with the shipping. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But let me just tell you, my advice is to pick a C or D term whenever possible. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Bill. So a little bit more about those C or D terms. Today, time wouldn't allow us to go thoroughly through every one of these Incoterms. There's 11 of them total, and cover the other things we want to cover. So I don't want to burn too much time on it. And certainly Bill or I would be happy to address specific Incoterm questions, after the program here. But if we look at the C and the D terms in particular, there are 4 C terms there. And really you can look at these in groups of 2. CFR and CPT are really the same term. The only difference is CFR is only used with ocean freight or sea freight. So if you have an air freight shipment to Paris, France, okay, Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France, you would want to use CPT Paris, France, or Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, not CFR, because CFR is an ocean freight term. Now, if you had an export to the ocean port of Marseille, France, you could use CFR, Marseille Port, France. So CFR and CPT are kind of kissing cousins as far as the terms go, and CIF and CIP are also connected or kissing cousins. CIF is ocean freight only or sea freight only. CIP is any mode. The difference in these C terms really in these groups is that you'll notice in CIF and CIP, there's an I in the term. That means you, the exporter, are securing the cargo insurance. Whereas with CFR and CPT, you're moving the freight to an overseas airport or ocean port, but you're not securing the cargo insurance. So my word of advice to you on Incoterms is that if you're going to use a C term, I would suggest you use CIF or CIP, we actually tell our clients that those are the two best terms of all the 11 terms for US exporters to use, because it gives you enough control over the process to make sure that exporting compliance is adhered to, and that you've been paid for the goods, and that the documentation is correct, and you've met the deadlines as far as shipping dates, and you have some oversight on shipping rates and remaining competitive. So it gives you enough control with those things. And it also includes cargo insurance, CIF, CIP. But when it gets to that overseas airport or ocean port, now your customer takes over their customs process in their country, which is really better because they know their country better than you do. And so you're leaving that part to them. So if we were to summarize Incoterms for you, I would tell you that my recommendation to any US exporter is the two best terms of all the 11 terms are CIF for ocean and CIP for air freight. If you go to the next slide, Bill, it covers the D terms. If you remember, there's E, F, C, and D terms, 11 total. We like the C and the D terms, gives you more control for all the reasons I mentioned. The D terms, so the C terms get the cargo to an overseas airport or ocean port. The D terms get the cargo to a door point. D means door or delivered, but we also say D means danger, because when you choose a D term, you are taking on the responsibility, depending on which one you choose, which D term you choose, to do something in the overseas country. Whereas when you choose a C term, you're going to get it to the overseas port or airport, but at that point, your responsibility ends. With a D term, your responsibility carries over a little further to something in their country. And you may be forced into a D term at some point. There are 3 D terms. DPU is delivered at place, unloaded. DAP is delivered at place, so not unloaded. That's the real distinction between DPU and DAP. And those are for all modes. Actually, all the D terms can be used for all modes. There's no distinction between ocean freight or air freight. And then DDP is, we call this the whole shooting match. When you sell something DDP, let's say it's DDP Amsterdam, the Netherlands, okay? That means you're gonna make the product, you're gonna document it, you're gonna package it up, you're gonna hire the freight forwarder, you're gonna move the freight to the Netherlands by air or ocean or what have you. And then once it gets to the Netherlands, you're actually gonna be responsible for the customs clearance, paying any duties or taxes to the Netherlands government, and the delivery in the Netherlands. DDP means you, the exporter, have total responsibility for everything. As a result, we don't usually recommend DDP as a term to our clients. Again, we like CIF, CIP, and if we're going to suggest a D term to a client, we suggest DAP. That means your customer is doing the customs clearance in their country, but then you, through your freight forwarder, pick up the ball again to make the delivery to their facility, but they still have to unload the freight when it gets to their facility. That's what DAP, delivered at place, means, whereas a DPU means you might have some unloading responsibility, at their location. So there's a lot with Incoterms. We often do an Incoterm program, and it's 3 hours by itself, just talking about Incoterms. We don't have the luxury to do that today. I wanted to give you a bit of a flavor. I wanted to make sure you understood that the C or the D terms is where we typically suggest that our customers try to land whenever possible. It's not always possible, but we try to recommend that. I think what would be useful, if you go to the next slide, Bill, there's an Incoterms chart here. You can't really make it out too well. That wasn't the point of my putting it in the presentation. If you go to our website under the Learning Center, you can click on this. You'll get a better view of it. This is not a chart that's specific to us at LR. The International Chamber of Commerce is the entity that sort of governs Incoterms. And this chart, there are many versions of this chart all over the place. Many freight forwarders have sort of adopted this chart to help their clients. You can find this, you can Google it, but the chart lays out seller and buyer responsibilities by Incoterm. They list the Incoterms across the top there, and then all sorts of little things that come up that people have to pay for, and what responsibility you as the seller have or the exporter, what responsibility your customer has overseas. So it's a useful chart. If you go to the next slide, Bill, this has got some real world examples that I'll give you on Incoterms, and then we'll move to methods of payment here. What do we see in the marketplace from our customers as far as Incoterms? We see, I will tell you, with Mexico, we see a lot of misuse of Incoterms with Mexico. Everybody and their brother ships FOB Laredo, Texas for Mexico. And then their customer in Mexico takes over the customs clearance process in Mexico and so forth. Do we recommend that? Well, we do recommend that the Mexican customer be responsible for the customs clearance. Mexico is one of those very difficult customs destinations. There's some others like Brazil and a few others, Russia, a few others, but Mexico is definitely difficult. So letting your customer in Mexico handle the customs clearance and even the delivery into Mexico, yes, that's a good thing to do. FOB Laredo is a misuse of the term. You may remember from previous slides, some Incoterms are ocean freight only. FOB is one of them. Laredo is not an ocean freight port. Laredo is a cross-border location. There are some others like Brownsville, Texas, and El Paso, very common, Tijuana, very common cross-border points, but they're not ocean ports. So FOB is a misuse of the term. It really should be FCA Laredo, Texas. Okay, free carrier to Laredo, Texas. What does it mean? It means you're going to be responsible for the shipping, the trucking most likely, to Laredo, Texas. And once the freight gets to Laredo, your customer then will take over the process. Now keep this in mind. When you ship FOB or FCA Laredo, like we're talking about, it's still an export. So you can't consider that a domestic transaction or sale, even though you're shipping it to Texas, because you're selling it to an international customer who happens to be in Mexico. That means there's going to be an export declaration or AES filing, which is one of our compliance points we'll talk about in a minute. And you, the exporter, have to make sure that that export declaration is filed correctly. Unfortunately, with FCA Laredo, oftentimes the Mexican buyer who's doing the customs clearance also has their customs broker or freight forwarder in Laredo do the export declaration filing on your behalf, you, the exporter. And sometimes they don't do it correctly because they're working for the buyer in Mexico, and that's their number one priority. We'll talk about that in a minute when we get to compliance, but it's something to be aware of. DDP into Mexico is not possible. It's actually illegal for a US company to serve as the importer of record in Mexico. So you can do a DDP shipment to Mexico, but you need your Mexican customer's involvement as the importer of record. What you would be doing is funding the DDP transaction. So let's say you have a warranty replacement part you have to send to Mexico, and your customer in Mexico said, I'm angry because this is broken or it doesn't work right. Send me a new one. And they don't want to pay for anything because they're saying, hey, it's under warranty. Get me a new one. You can do that, but they have to be the importer of record in Mexico because it's illegal for you, a US company, to be the importer of record. So you can do DDP, but only in name. It's actually a DAP transaction where your customer's doing the customs clearance, but you're funding it. You can pay for everything so the customer doesn't have to because they're already maybe angry about needing a replacement part. Now, Canada is just the opposite. US companies can be what are called non-resident importers in Canada. As a US company, you can actually do a customs clearance in your name in Canada and settle with Revenue Canada, the customs service up there, and they allow that. Okay, so different markets. C terms when exporting on open account. So this is what I mentioned before. If you've not been completely paid for your shipment, you definitely want to consider a C or a D term. Why? Well, if you haven't been paid and you're expecting to be paid as the transaction goes along, and you use your freight forwarder to move the goods overseas, if you haven't been paid, you can actually put a hold on the shipment through your freight forwarder and use that as leverage to make sure you get paid. If you use your customer's freight forwarder, you're not going to be able to put a hold on it because why? They work for your customer. They don't work for you. So if you haven't been paid, but you're using your customer's freight forwarder, any chance of using the release of the shipment as leverage to get paid is out the window. So if you haven't been paid in full, definitely a C or a D term of one sort or another is probably, what we would recommend. How do air freight shipments and ocean freight shipments differ in Incoterm usage? They don't differ very much, actually. The key is the type of term. We mentioned that some terms are ocean freight only, like FOB or CFR or CIF. Those are all ocean freight terms. So if you're not making an ocean freight shipment, you really shouldn't be using those terms. There is a partner term like FCR, or FCA rather. There's a partner term that you can use if it's not an ocean freight shipment. Other than that, the process that you're responsible for is very similar. If you ship CIF to an ocean port or CIP to an airport, when the goods arrive at that ocean port or airport, you then are off the hook, or essentially your responsibility has ended. So it's not very different. It's really about the terms that you're using. The one slight difference is for air freight. When the plane lands at, let's say, Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, it is now the responsibility of your customer. Whereas with ocean freight, the ship docks and then the goods actually have to be craned off of the ship before you, the exporter, before your responsibility ends. It's a little bit of a difference there. When is Ex Works acceptable? Unfortunately, I'm going to rock your world a little bit and tell you never. My recommendation is that you never use Ex Works. If you are committed to using an Incoterm that gives up your involvement right at your door, please use FCA your facility. So if your facility is in, I don't know, Crystal Lake, Illinois, please use FCA Crystal Lake, Illinois, not Ex Works. Why? When you use Ex Works, you give up the export declaration filing responsibility to your customer overseas freight forwarder. And that's a dangerous practice because that export declaration filing to our government, to the US government, is not only required, but it's required to be perfect. Every data element has to be correct. You want your freight forwarder or your company, you can actually do it as a shipper. You want to be in control of that export declaration filing to the US government. When you ship Ex Works, you're not in control of it. If your customer's freight forwarder makes a mistake on that export declaration filing, you get the fine or penalty because you're the exporter of record in that transaction. So I don't think from a liability standpoint, it ever makes sense to use Ex Works. I would get rid of it. I wish it wasn't even one of the 11 Incoterms, frankly. FCA your facility, if you have to go that route, would be better. If I'm your freight forwarder, I'm going to talk through with you why I don't even think FCA your facility is really the best idea. Again, we like C and D terms because we believe it provides you with the whole package. But in some cases, you have no choice. Maybe you're selling to a very large customer and they say, look, we have a transportation system. We have to handle it. We're going to handle it. If you want to sell to us, that's the way it's going to be. Okay, no problem. But FCA your facility, not Ex Works. You can go to the next slide, Bill. Running a little short on time here, and I know there's a few questions, so we'll get to those in a second. Let me talk to you a minute about methods of payment, and then we'll talk a little bit about export compliance and then address some questions. What you see here is kind of a risk scale for you, the exporter, based on what method of payment or payment instrument or payment agreement you have with your customer overseas. So number one, cash in advance. You'll see that down at the bottom there, cash in advance is very risky for the buyer, that is your customer overseas, and virtually zero risk other than compliance for you, the exporter. Why? Well, you've been paid everything up front. So we have a lot of exporters who say, oh, well, then that's just what I'm going to do. I'm just going to say, look, if you want my stuff, just give me all the money and then we'll send it. Well, that's great. If you happen to make something where there are no competitors anywhere in the world, then I guess you can dictate, pay me everything and we'll ship it. But if you have competitors, and they happen to be offering customers any kind of terms or flexible payment options, you might find yourself losing orders, as a result. So you want to be careful. I mean, cash in advance, they say cash is king, cash in fist, right? That's the CIF, cash in fist. It's another Incoterm. It's great to get paid up front. I would say it's maybe a little naive to think that all export orders, that's the way it'll be. Again, unless you have some sort of corner or monopoly on your particular product. Moving down the scale, so cash in advance is risky for the buyer because they're not, maybe this is the first time you've ever done business, they're not 100% sure about your product or quality. They have to give up all the money and then wait for the goods to get to them, right? Conversely, open account, number 5 at the bottom, a bit risky for you, the exporter, because what you've said to the customer overseas is you can pay me in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And you're going to ship the goods, and there's a good chance the customer will actually have your product before they pay you. So what if they don't pay you? I mean, all sales are great, but you got to get paid, right? I mean, it's not a sale until you get paid, actually. So open account is a bit risky for you, the exporter, and not risky for the buyer, really, because they're ordering from you, you're sending it to them, and then they're paying you at a later date, right? Now, the terms in between there, letter of credit, site and time draft, those are banking instruments that provide protection to both seller and buyer. It involves using your bank and your customer overseas bank to serve kind of as intermediaries or mediators, so to speak, in the transaction. And you have to perform as an exporter. So the letter of credit is a contract, and it will typically lay out what you have to do. You have to ship by a certain date. You have to ship 1,000 widgets if that's the quantity in this price, and provide documents that prove this. The buyer has to set money aside, sort of like an escrow with a bank, their bank overseas, and that money has your name on it. And how do you unlock the payment? You perform, you ship when you're supposed to, you send them what you're supposed to. The documents prove this. And as the documents make their way through the banking network, the money is released to you and the documents are released to your customer, and then they get the goods, and in a perfect world, everybody's happy. Site and time drafts are variations of that process. They are banking instruments, but your customer overseas does not have to deposit money in escrow for that transaction. That's an important point, because if you do everything right, you may still not get paid, because if the bank contacts your customer and your customer says, yeah, we're short this month, we don't have the money, there's no obligation to send you the money. So you're using the banking network for collection of your receivable, but there may not be any money there. So a letter of credit is better there. So I wanted you to see the difference in payment options and the risk scale. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into compliance and the Incoterms. Now, Bill, did you want to take any questions right now, or just keep going?
Let's keep going.
Okay. All right. So go ahead to the next slide then. Now we're going to talk a minute about compliance. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh yeah, we did the real world. That's okay. We did the real world.
Did I go the wrong direction? No, we're going the other.
Yeah, that's okay. Now you want to go to the compliance. There you go. Yeah. So now we're going to talk a little bit about compliance. Okay. Basically, simply put, our government requires that exporters, no matter what Incoterm you choose, that exporters comply with US law when it comes to exporting. And the most typical regulations that probably most of you on this webinar would deal with are what are called the Export Administration Regulations, the EAR. Export Administration Regulations are for all commercial transactions for export that don't have any kind of military or essentially controlled licensable aspect to them. So if you're just selling commercial, I don't know, conference tables or nuts and bolts, or if your product is not for military application, the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, are the regulations you have to adhere to. If you just dive into these, they can be a little bit confusing. There's an entity within the Department of Commerce, the U.S. Department of Commerce, called the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is sort of the police force for export compliance. That's the group that watches exports from the United States, from all companies in the United States, and makes sure that they're complying with the law. You'll see there on the screen that as part of the Bureau of Industry and Securities, and you can go right to their website, BIS is what it is, Bureau of Industry and Security. They have an export compliance manual and a system that you can just adopt. Actually, they want you to adopt it. It's their system, and they want exporters to kind of follow their system. And it will guide you through what's critical for you as an exporter to pay attention to and to audit with every one of your export shipments. So if you go to the next slide, Bill, this is the 9 core elements of what the Bureau of Industry and Security, the police force for commerce, for our government, the 9 things that they're saying every company needs to have in place. And this is really about shepherding or managing your export compliance program. And you can see some of them there. Management commitment is the first one. So they want to know that your top management people are committed to following the law. And if for no other reason to follow the law, other than it's the right thing to do, but if for no other reason, there are many fines and penalties that an exporter can be hit with if they don't follow the export administration regulations, the law as it pertains to exporting. Now, to boil it down for you, you can go to the next slide, Bill. This is just best practices, which I'm not going to spend really a lot of time on. Again, you can go to the Bureau of Industry and Security website and look at what they say is the best way to, to construct this. But the heart of it is really the next 2 slides. So if we go to the next slide, Bill, what I've given you here are 8 points that with every export, if you ask yourself as the exporter, okay, let's run through these 8 points. With every export, did I cover all 8 of these points? If your answer is yes, if you've addressed all 8 points, you're going to be in very good shape as far as following the law. First one there is the export declaration. I mentioned it. That's a data element driven electronic process that records everything about your export, who you are, who the buyer is, what you're exporting, the value of it, tariff code numbers, et cetera, et cetera. In most cases, your freight forwarder is going to file this on your behalf, but they need engagement from you and they need information from you in order to do it. If it's done correctly and on time, wonderful. That's what the government requires. If it's not, you can be fined or penalized as a result. Screening, you have to screen the customers overseas that you sell to against denied parties and denied persons lists that the US government makes available to the public. These are persons and companies that our government says you cannot do business with for a variety of reasons. They may be terrorist organizations, or there's just a variety of reasons. So when you export to a customer, whether that's a distributor or an end user, you have to make sure that they don't appear on one of these denied party lists. Embargoed countries are those places that our government has said you cannot export to. A lot of you know the common names like Iran and Cuba and North Korea. Those are all still on the list. There's some slightly less common names like Syria and a few others. For a while there, Chad in Africa was on the list. Libya was on, and then it was off again. So those embargoed countries are places you can't export to. You can find those at OFAC.gov, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. That's pretty easy. I mean, if you get a request from Iran, most people are smart enough to say to themselves, wait a minute, I'm not sure we can do that. But you've got to address that. Commodities and products, some products are not intended for military use. However, they could have what's called a dual use, meaning that they could be used for military application with the right manipulation or what have you. So you need to be aware of that. You need to know if your products or commodities are on what's called the CCL, the Controlled Commodity List. And there's some information there with regard to that. If you go to the next slide, Bill. Illegal diversion, that's a big one. You have to have language on your commercial invoice that tells anybody you sell to that they can't illegally divert your product to one of those countries back on the OFAC list that we can't do business with. So that's important because a lot of exporters think, well, if I sell to somebody in Germany and they've paid me and I've sent the product over there and the deal is done, then I'm off the hook. I have all the paperwork that shows that I sold it to the company in Germany and I'm good. Well, that company in Germany then takes your product and ships it to a customer of theirs, let's say in Iran. That's illegal. They can't divert your goods because they were made in the USA to a buyer in a country that we don't have a free trading relationship with, that there's a sanction in place against. Now, how do you protect against a customer doing that? Because you would never know they did it. You have to have anti-diversion language on your commercial invoice. And that will say to that customer, do not divert this illegally. And we can talk offline if you want to have that. If you don't know that language, I can get you that language. Anti-boycott is just you can't adhere to a foreign country's sanction on another country. So if you got a request from Honduras, a customer in Honduras who said, please tell us in a written document that you do not, none of your product is made in Guatemala because we don't like Guatemala. You can't adhere to that request. That's prejudicial against Guatemala, and the U.S. government says we're not going to allow our companies in our country to adhere to an illegal boycott. Foreign Corrupt Trade Practices Act, simply don't bribe foreign officials to get business. Don't let any of your people do it. Is buying somebody lunch a bribe? No, almost certainly not. Is bringing somebody, a foreign official over with their family to Disney World for a couple of weeks, paying for everything and sending them home with a bunch of presents so that you get a contract? Yes, that's a problem. You don't want to do that. So that's pretty straightforward. Record keeping, you've got to keep records, and you have to keep them for at least 5 years. And records are everything, all paperwork, sales contracts, quotes, dialogue with overseas customers. Our government requires that you keep records, and if they ask for them, you have to be able to produce them within a reasonable amount of time. That's typically within 30 days of the request. So those are the 8 key elements to export compliance. And you can see with these elements that if you're not in control of the shipment, at least to a point, again, those C or D Incoterms, it's really hard to make sure that the vendors that are involved and all the moving parts adhere to all these 8 points. Now, on the next slide is don't let this happen to you. You can Google this. This is the Bureau of Industry and Security's publication where they cite some export infractions that have occurred. So companies that have broken the law, export law, either accidentally or on purpose. This document, it's a little booklet, but it's online. It's an electronic booklet. It details, the various infractions. The reason I put it up there, and it might be useful for you to take a look at it or download it or whatever. Some of them are just accidental, inadvertent breaking of export law, and it'd be good to just read some of those. Some of them are obvious. The company knew that they were illegally diverting goods to Iran, and they were getting paid big money to do it. Of course, that's just breaking the law. That's just a blatant breaking of the law. Those are easy. It's the stuff that is accidental. I thought it might be useful for you to see it. If you go to the next slide, Bill, this is a follow-up from the last program. How do you choose a freight forwarder? A lot of the same things with any vendor, any service provider. You've got to feel comfortable with their capabilities. They have to have the coverage around the world. It'd be good if they were moving products or projects similar to what you're moving or shipping or exporting or selling. If you are if you sell corn and you're talking to a freight forwarder that has never shipped a bulk commodity like that before, maybe not a good fit for you. So things like that. And then the next slide is really just some information about us and questions. So as far as the academic material, we went kind of fast. That's what I have. And then Bill, if you wanted to address some questions, we're a little over here, but I'm happy to stay and address some.
Right. Sorry, everybody, about the not having the full screen. Not sure why I got stuck, but this is from Sophia. We have 2 questions. You know what? I'll reach out to Sophia. She's one of our regular clients. I'll reach out and connect you with Sophia directly, Paul.
Okay, no problem.
You know what? I'll move on from there. You know what? I'm going to say that that was outstanding, Paul. I asked Paul to, tell us about Incoterms, but also give us some of your advice, some of your experience, some of your suggestions of what real life business applications and situations. And that's what that was about. So that was tremendously valuable. really good work. I appreciate it, Paul. That was, I think, really useful and above and beyond what you'd normally get in a webinar or a seminar about freight forwarding. So thanks much. That was great. Just to finish up, if the ITC is here, I can connect you with Paul if you've got any further, like I will, Sophia will connect with Paul for any further questions. In terms of what we do at the ITC, if you, again, want to get into any detail of exporting or how to export, let us know. I'll just say, in terms of my advice to you, is if you think exporting is a good idea, commit to it. You can't do it halfway. There's things we can do and talk to you about. Is your product ready to export? We can work with you to make a plan. We can identify and research on the top markets for you to look at. We can talk about the channel and customers and how to get to them. We can help you connect with state or federal agencies such as the Department of Commerce to find a pool of partners to work with in those target countries, and then we can help you with that selection and negotiations, et cetera. In terms of that's what I spent my career doing. So I certainly can provide some insights into that process. And then you start. And coming back to, we've got access through the ITC, access a network of experts like Paul on freight forwarding, and create your international team. We've got people that know about shipping and payments and compliance and other issues. We've got a network of experts behind us that we'll connect you with, and onto exporting. Finally, just stay tuned. We've got more webinars coming up at the ITC. Next month, we'll talk about distribution. After that, we'll talk about getting paid. After that, we'll talk about e-commerce, and then onwards. Every month, we'll have a webinar. Finally, that's where you can find me. And again, I'll say, going international, it's hard work, but it's good for your business. And getting into, if some of this sounded complicated, keep in mind that 20-some% of American exports are exporting is done by small business. So all these other small companies in the US are doing all this work, right? They're doing this. They've got their teams together. So it's after you set up your structures and set up your process and set up your team, you can do this. I'll leave you with that. If you want to provide any feedback, let's see if there's any final questions, Paul, and we'll wrap it up. There's Kevin. Well done. Thanks for that, Kevin. And you know what? That's it. We're a little over. Thanks for listening, everybody. Paul, again, outstanding. And we'll see you all at a future webinar.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.